Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Hopefully, everyone can hear me. Welcome back for week number 2 of our course, and hopefully, we'll have a little bit better connectivity this evening as opposed to what we had last week when I was at the conference. So, fingers crossed. Hopefully, everything will go well tonight. I have my camera on. If I do start to experience any types of connectivity issues, I'll just switch my camera off and buy myself a little bit of extra bandwidth. But welcome back. This is week number 2. Everyone's had a chance to kind of digest the syllabus and digest all the course requirements that we covered in class last week, as well as some of that foundational information that we also covered last week to kind of get us started as a class together. So, what I have planned for us this evening, as you know, since last week we had those connectivity issues, we didn't get a chance to do our breakout groups. I thought what might work best tonight, though, is rather than starting with the breakout groups, if we go ahead and cover our information for tonight, which is basically looking at differences between public and private sector organizations with an eye upon effectiveness. So, what do these differences mean for effectiveness in the public versus the private sectors? Cover that information in the first half of class tonight, take a break, and then in the second half of class tonight, we'll go ahead and circle back to those breakout groups, and we'll get into our breakout groups and talk about the definition of effectiveness and how we can measure effectiveness in the public and nonprofit sectors. And so I think that might work a little bit better. Cover our information first, and then move on to our breakout groups in the second half of class. But before we get to that, just a reminder, you have your first graded Canvas essay post that is going to be due. Your initial post is due by Saturday, and then responses to 2 of your classmates due then by the following Monday. For that Canvas essay, you are looking at this issue of effectiveness. You're telling me what effectiveness means, your definition of effectiveness, how we can measure effectiveness, and then highlighting one organization that you think is an effective organization versus one organization that you would deem to be an ineffective organization, just so we can add a little bit of tangibility, if you will, so that we're actually identifying not only what effectiveness means for us, but some examples of what effectiveness looks like or doesn't look like in public and nonprofit organizations. So again, your initial post due by Saturday at midnight, and then responses to 2 classmates next on Monday. Leslie, go ahead.
Yeah, I know for the discussion posts, we're supposed to have at least three citations. Do they have to be scholarly articles, or can we cite like current events, newspaper articles, that sort of thing?
That's a great question. Especially for this one, you can cite things other than journal articles because I don't think the journal articles be all that helpful for this one. So yeah, something with current events, especially if you're talking about an effective versus ineffective organization, absolutely go beyond journal articles.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. And thanks for mentioning that. That's an excellent point. So yeah, the types of references you're going to be using in these Canvas essays will depend upon the prompt itself. So for this one, not so much the journal articles, more contemporary types of sources. Okay. Okay, let me also then open it up for any questions that you have or clarifications needed in terms of the syllabus, the course requirements, and all that information that we covered in the first part of class last week. Anyone have any questions at this time? Okay. And again, if any questions do emerge as we progress through the class, as always, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions, provide any clarifications as necessary. So here in the first half of class tonight, I thought we would talk about some of these differences between public and private sector organizations that have impacts upon import for this idea of organizational effectiveness. And I know this is information that you have covered multiple times so far in the program. Probably a majority of your courses have had some type of a focus on differences between public and private sectors. What I want to do tonight is talk about those differences and what they then mean for measuring effectiveness. And so some of this information will be kind of old hat for you. You've already been there and done that. We're going to just kind of put a little bit of a new twist on it to make it fit within the parameters of this class, because it's important for us, if we're truly going to measure effectiveness, it's important for us to recognize the different characteristics of public and nonprofit versus private organizations, and how some of those characteristics may inhibit effectiveness some of those characteristics may make it a little bit more difficult to measure effectiveness. It's really important we have a good understanding of those primary differences. So, as we all know, one of the primary essential distinctions between public and private sector organizations is this whole idea of a bottom line. So, private sector organizations operate to make a profit. Their revenues that they use to operate will come from that profit that they are generating. Public sector organizations, for the most part, do not operate to make a profit. So I think the purpose of public organizations versus private organizations is a fundamental difference. I would argue that that difference of not having that bottom line, not having that profit motivation in the public sector, I would argue that that is a necessary but not sufficient distinction between the sectors. It is a necessary difference, but it is not the sole difference between the sectors. So it is an important one, but it's not the only one. We also know that we have decisions we have to make in terms of the amount of government intervention in the provision and production of goods and services. So when we see public organizations getting involved in the production and provision of goods and services, they oftentimes do that, as we know, because of the existence of market failures. The private sector either chooses not to provide this good or service or simply cannot provide this good or this service. If there's no bottom line, they're probably going to choose not to do it. If there are very high monetary obstacles to getting involved in the provision and production of a good or service, then the private sector probably won't do it. And so if getting involved in this new sector, in this new industry is cost prohibitive, then they're probably going to leave it to the public sector. You think of something like everyday mail delivery. So granted, we do have companies like FedEx and UPS and all these other companies that do their package delivery, Amazon. But when it comes to everyday mail delivery, for a private sector company to get involved in everyday mail delivery, the cost would just be prohibitive. It would just cost way too much money to get involved in that sector, and there wouldn't be enough payoff to justify those costs of starting up operations. Not to mention that when you read the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, one of the enumerated powers of Congress is to establish post offices. So the U.S. Postal Service actually has its genesis in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So when the market fails to provide or produce a good or service, then that recommends to us a role for government to step in that provision or production of that good or service. Now, about 4 times so far, and we've only been going for about 10 minutes, I have said provision and or production, because there is a difference between provision and production. Provision is providing or giving the resources to make the production of a good or service possible. So sometimes we have a market failure. We have the private sector that just will not get engaged in production. They do not want to produce. They don't want to create this good or this service. And so therefore it's left to government. Sometimes the private sector doesn't have the resources or want to devote the resources toward provision, giving the resources to make production possible. So we see a lot of different gradations here in terms of the roles of private versus public sectors in terms of provision and production. If you think about what we are doing here tonight, this is considered production. This is the actual delivery of this course in the MPA program. The resources that make tonight possible come from the tuition and fees that you pay, any types of subsidies that the program receives from the university. That's the provision. So it's important for us to really distinguish between provision and production when we're talking about the proper role of public or private sector in that provision and or that production. Now, typically, we tend to see government agencies, we tend to see public organizations engaged in the provision and the production of what we consider to be pure public good. So something like national defense is considered to be a pure public good. And you've probably covered this idea of public versus private goods in other courses in the past, but a pure public good is a good that is non-excludable and also non-exhaustible. So it's non-excludable. You cannot exclude people from partaking in the benefits of that good. It's also non-exhaustive, and that it cannot be used up. One person using it cannot use it up then for another person. So typically a pure public good, we're going to see government provision and production. The other end of the spectrum, as you know, are pure private goods. Those are excludable. Those are exhaustible. So in a pure private good, you can charge people. It has a chargeability mechanism. So people who pay the charge get the benefits of consuming that good. People who do not pay the charge are then excluded from consuming that good. In pure private goods, we tend to have pretty good agreement that it's the private sector that's responsible for provision and production. So that candy bar is a private good. The resources that go into making that candy bar are private resources, and the production of that candy bar is being done by a private sector corporation in the candy bar factory or wherever they happen to make candy bars. National defense, because it is non-exhaustible and non-excludable, that tends to be the domain of the national government. Now, granted, the national government, the Department of Defense, signs a lot of contracts with private sector defense contractors to create the implements of war. And so they'll sign a contract with, Northrop Grumman or with Boeing to produce aircraft, and those aircraft will then be used in the production of national defense. But those contracts are paid for by government, and then those planes are maintained by government officials, by members of the US military. They're flown by members of the US military. The actual production of national defense is done by the national government. So at those two extremes, the pure public and pure private, we don't have a whole lot of discussion about which sector of government should be involved. Where we do end up getting a lot of discussion is in that gray area between pure public and pure private goods, what we've identified as toll goods and collective pool goods. Toll goods are those goods that are excludable, but they are non-exhaustible. So if people don't pay for them, they can be excluded from partaking in the benefits of those goods. But one person using up the good does not eliminate it for someone else who wants to use that good. So that toll road is a good example of a toll good. Then there are common pool goods, which are just the opposite of toll goods. So if a common pool good, those common pool goods are possible. They can be used up, but they are non-excludable. That we cannot exclude people from partaking in their benefits. So things such as natural resources, mineral pools, those types of things are considered to be collective pool goods. So where we really argue about the proper role of government and government organizations in provision and production is in terms of that gray area, toll goods versus collective pool goods. We also tend to see government involvement in provision and production, not only when it's a pure public good, but we also see their involvement when we have the potential for free riders. So if there's a potential for people who are benefiting from the good and they're not paying for that good. If you have a lot of free riders, and those free riders are there because of what we call the positive externalities. So there are positive consequences that will accrue because of the provision and production of this good or this service. Those positive externalities will then flow beyond just the people who are purchasing this good and will then also positively impact people who are not paying for that good. So you think about something like a immunization program, a childhood immunization program. So we have a childhood immunization program that is targeting low-income households. So those children in those low-income households who are receiving those immunizations are obviously your primary beneficiaries. However, the benefits of immunizing children will then expand beyond just those households and will extend out to the community because there'll be less risk of people getting sick in the larger community. That then leads to hopefully fewer missed days of work, higher levels of productivity, and so on and so on. So people who are benefiting from this good or service, that are not paying directly for the good or service, those are free riders who are getting those positive externalities. The problem is if you have that program funded exclusively by the private sector, when the private sector makes its supply and demand decisions, it's going to make those decisions based upon customers who are consuming that good or that service. Some customers who are paying for that good or that service. It will not take into account all those free riders in terms of the benefits of this good or service that's being provided and produced. So the more free riders, the more positive externalities you have, the more that recommends to us a role for government to get involved in provision and production. Then, as we know, there are also negative externalities, negative consequences, negative spillovers. Classic example is pollution. So as the economists like to say, we have a widget factory. And this widget factory up on the hill is making widgets. In the course of making those widgets, that widget factory is polluting the river that runs behind the widget factory. There's no economic incentive beyond just being altruistic for the owners of that widget factory to clean up that pollution. There's no monetary benefit to them for doing so. So it's up to government to then step in and find these producers of that pollution and then also clean up that pollution of that river. So essentially here, regardless of whether it's a positive externality or a negative externality, both of those situations recommend a role for government in provision and production. The irony here is that goods that tend to result in negative externalities tend to be overproduced. And they're overproduced because, again, the corporation is not taking into account the cost of cleaning up the pollution when they are making their production decisions. So they're going to continue producing this good or service irrespective of what it's doing to the environment. So the role for government is to then intervene and then to try and reduce the production of that good or service by, again, applying fines to the polluter, by making the polluter pay for cleaning up that river. So that's a role for government to play in trying to diminish the production of that negative externality. Obviously, with a positive externality, there's an incentive for government to get involved to try and increase the creation of that positive externality. So this is where government may get involved in terms of subsidizing the production of a good or service, because goods that result in positive externalities, those goods tend to be underproduced because, again, the corporation's not going to take into account all those positive externalities, all those positive benefits that are occurring to people who are not paying for this good. They're only going to take into account the demand from their consumers who are actually paying for the good. So government gets involved to pay for and subsidize the production of the good or service so that they can boost production and therefore boost the amount of positive externalities. So we see a role for government where there are negative as well as positive externalities as well. So when we want to know whether or not government should, in kind of a normative way, be involved in provision or production, we look at what type of good it is. Is it non-excludable? Is it non-exhaustible? We'll then also look at the externalities. Are there negative externalities? Are there positive externalities that accrue from the production of this good or this service? Then there are also political rationales for government involvement in these sectors of the economy. And one of the primary political rationales is this thing known as expectancy theory. The idea is that whenever a crisis occurs, someone needs to step in. And usually it's the national government that steps in to try and mitigate the negative impacts of that crisis. So we have a Great Depression. As a result of that Great Depression, we see the national government stepping in with all these grants and aid that's providing to state and local governments to help pull them out of the throes of the Great Depression. Once the Great Depression is over and the economy has stabilized, we don't see the national government then retract back to its original level of provision and production. We see the national government continuing to provide and produce those goods and services. We see those grants and aid programs continuing. We see those agencies created in FDR's New Deal continuing. So it kind of raises the level of activity of the national government even after the crisis is over. We don't see that level go down. We continue to see the national government doing these types of programs, paying for these types of programs. You think about something like the Great Recession, in 2008. Similar type of situation happened there, where the national government then stepped in to help bail out companies, bail out industries because of the Great Recession, helping individuals, individual homeowners, and providing subsidies. They still do it today, and so that level of provision and production still maintains at that higher level because people have come to expect that. Once the national government gets involved in provision and production of a good or service, it's very hard for them to step away from that provision and production because people become dependent upon it. People then come to expect that this is a role that the national government will continue to play in the future. So we have some economic rationales like market failures and externalities for why we have public involvement in provision and production. But then we also have these political rationales as well in terms of things such as expectancy theory. Well, so what? What does this mean for our discussion? What it means for our discussion is obviously the more goods and services that the public sector gets involved in the provision and production of, the bigger the scope of our struggle in trying to identify and facilitate effectiveness. That we have the public sector starting to get involved in some aspects of the economy that used to be the domain of the private sector, then instead of just looking at things like what we would normally look at in the public sector, now we have to start to be worrying about market-based types of calculations as well, because now the public sector is starting to do things that the private sector used to do. When the public sector gets involved in provision and production, we know that the values of the public sector can sometimes be somewhat different than the values that underpin the private sector. If you're running a private sector corporation, you are really going to be trying to obviously make a profit. You're trying to sell as many units as you possibly can at the highest price point that you can. You really place a major emphasis on efficiency, real major emphasis on trying to do more with less to enhance that profit margin. So clearly in the private sector, we expect to be efficient. We also expect to be as effective as we possibly can be. In the public sector, in addition to efficiency and effectiveness, we obviously have other values that underpin public administration, things such as social equity and social justice, the protection of individual rights, political responsiveness, being responsive to political leaders, to the executive, to the legislature, to the courts. You'll add on there as well representative bureaucracy, trying to create a bureaucracy that is representative of the population that it serves. So this will fundamentally change the way in which we measure effectiveness. Effectiveness is no longer just how many units we're selling and how much of a profit we are making. Now effectiveness can go beyond that and look at how well we are promoting social justice through programs like equal employment opportunity and affirmative action, how well we are protecting individual rights through things like qualified good faith immunity. And the paper that I presented at the conference last week, one of the parts of that paper looked at this idea of qualified good faith immunity on the part of public administrators and how the courts over the past 50 years have really kind of changed their interpretation of what is meant by qualified good faith immunity. Essentially, qualified good faith immunity means that you will be shielded from civil and criminal litigation if you are endeavoring to not violate the constitutional rights of people you come into contact with. If there was an obvious violation of constitutional rights, and there are a couple of cases, the Hope v. Pelsner case and the Brogios case, both of those cases in 2002 and 2020 both said if it's an obvious violation of constitutional rights, then qualified good faith immunity is no longer a protection for that public administrator. So you need to know the rights of the people you are dealing with and then endeavor not to violate those rights. When you look at the American Society for Public Administration and its code of conduct, there are 8 principles. One of the principles, principle number 8, says that we are expected as public administrators to uphold and protect laws and constitutions. We need to uphold and protect the constitutional rights of those people that we come into contact with. So those are values that certainly underpin public administration that go beyond just merely efficiency and effectiveness, like we may see with a corollary private organization. So the more values that we have that we need to adhere to in the public sector, the more complicated it is for us to identify and then measure indicators of effectiveness for our public organizations. So more values means it's more complicated to do what we are doing here in this class. In a previous course, you may have read some work by an author by the name of Mark Moore. And whenever I teach the 610 course, I always have my students read an article by Moore and Bennington. And it's an article that talks about this idea of public administrators needing to be proactive. Public managers need to be proactive in their management and leadership roles. Because whenever you have the public sector that is getting involved in the provision and or production of a good or a service, when the public sector gets involved, it is usually by definition displacing private sector resources. So traditionally, the private sector would be doing it. Now the public sector is getting involved in displacing those private sector resources, which means that when the public sector gets involved, that public involvement must produce something whose benefits will outweigh the costs of production. There needs to be some net benefit for government doing this as opposed to leaving it to the private sector. And oftentimes those additional benefits will come in the form of things such as representative bureaucracy, political responsiveness, protection of individual rights, promotion of social equity and social justice. That's usually where these additional benefits come from when we have government or public sector involvement as opposed to leaving it to the private sector. In essence, what Moore tells us is that it's not all about efficiency like it is in the private sector. There are a lot of other values that we must champion in the public sector when we get involved in the provision and or production of these different types of goods and services. So what it really kind of boils down to, this whole discussion up this point in time, is that it is more complicated to measure effectiveness in the public sector because of all these additional values. And not only do we have more values, but at certain points in time, one value may come into conflict with another value. So promoting a representative bureaucracy sometimes could come into conflict with the efficiency in terms of the hiring process. You think about if any of you are in HR and any of you do hiring in public organizations, you know how sometimes protracted the hiring process can be. I know at my university, whenever we've gone out there and we've hired, the hiring process takes a lot longer than it would if you were at a private university. At a private university, you can interview pretty much whomever you want. You can then hire whomever you want. You can hire them as quickly as you would like. Basically, as soon as they can get their paperwork filed through payroll, they can be hired into the position. We know that's not the case in the public sector because we want to make sure that we have a diverse applicant pool. We want to make sure that the applicants that we are interviewing, it's a diverse pool of those semifinalists, a diverse pool of finalists. So we really take our time. And oftentimes you have to have your pools of applicants approved by an Office of Equity and Diversity at each step of the process. We do a lot of targeted recruitment in the public sector that you don't see nearly as much of that done in the private sector. So again, we're not looking at being necessarily as efficient as possible in hiring. We're looking at trying to create a representative bureaucracy. We're looking at trying to promote social justice and social equity. So whereas you may hire someone the same day in the private sector because they're an at-will employee, in the public sector, it may take you 3 months or 6 months or 9 months before you can hire an employee. And if you think about your position, if you're working in the public sector, it probably took several months or at least several weeks before you actually got that job offer. So it's about more values in the public sector than just efficiency, like it is oftentimes in the private sector. So it is much more complicated here in the public sector. Also, we tend to do ourselves a bit of a disservice when we talk about public and private sectors in a binary fashion. When you say, well, it's either a public organization or it's a private organization. We have to also realize that there are gradations of publicness or privateness, however you like to call it, but there are gradations along the way. So it's not just this is a private corporation, this is a government agency. So you see on this chart, that's essentially what we have here. At the top right of the chart, you have a private enterprise. So this is a private corporation. It is privately owned, it's privately held, it's led by a private individual. It's a truly private sector type of corporation. Then to the left of that, you see private corporations that are subject to general government regulations. And so you think about things such as OSHA regulations. There are general OSHA regulations that apply to pretty much all industries, regardless of the industry. But then there's a higher level of OSHA regulations that apply to specific industries. So industries like maritime industries, manufacturing industries, farming. Those types of industries are subject to a higher level of OSHA regulations. So private corporations that are subject to those types of government regulations would be in the next category. Then the category to the left of that are private corporations with significant funding from government contracts. So in this category, you're still talking about a private corporation, but it's a private corporation that's getting a good bit of its revenue from contracts with government organizations. Now, it still gets a majority of its revenues from private sources, but it's still getting a very good amount of its revenue from these types of contracts. To the left of that, you have heavily regulated private firms, things such as privately owned utilities. Privately owned utilities can't just set whatever fees they want, whatever charges they want. They have to usually go through a public utilities commission and have those fee increases approved by the Public Utilities Commission. So they are very heavily regulated, still private, but very heavily regulated. So after that, you have private corporations that are dependent upon government contracts for most of their revenue. So here we're looking at a lot of those defense contractors. So, General Dynamics is a good example. So most of their revenue is coming from these contracts they have with government. We know that once a private sector corporation enters into a contract with a government agency, that private organization almost becomes what we call quasi-public in nature, because it is then subject to a lot of the same limitations and a lot of the same regulations as a traditional governmental entity. Then to the left of that, you have private nonprofit organizations that are totally reliant upon government contracts and grants. So these are nonprofits, they're private, but all of their revenue is coming from grants and from contracts. Then if you move to the bottom right of our chart, you have government program or agency operated largely through purchases from private vendors or producers, things like Medicare, public housing. This is an organization that is owned by government. This is truly a government organization, but it is operating largely through its interactions with private vendors. So it is really very much enmeshed within the world of the private sector, even though it is governmentally owned. To the left of that, you have what we call GSEs, which are government-sponsored enterprises. Government-sponsored enterprise is established by government, but it trades shares on the stock market. So things such as the Federal National Mortgage Association, that's a good example of this thing we call a GSE or a government-sponsored enterprise. Again, owned by the government, it's a government organization, but it trades shares on the stock exchange. To the left of that, you have state-owned enterprises or public corporations. These are usually referred to as government corporations. Things like we mentioned before, the U.S. Postal Service, Tennessee Valley Authority, Port Authority of Nevada. Those are state-owned enterprises, government corporations. Those government corporations are created by government. They are government organizations, but they can operate to make a profit. So they do or should have some type of a profit orientation to them. Now, the U.S. Postal Service, even though it's a government corporation and it operates to make a profit, as we all know, oftentimes it doesn't make a profit, but at least in theory, it has the ability to run a profit as a government corporation. And then to the left of that, you have your traditional government agency, a Department of Defense or, FDA or your traditional type of government agency that we normally think about when we think about a public organization. So I think this chart is important for us because it really does underscore this idea of the gradations in between a true private corporation and a true government type of agency. And that it's just not this binary distinction. It's just not a dichotomous distinction. There are a lot of gradations along the way. So my favorite question, as you know, is again, so what? So what does that mean for our study of effectiveness? Obviously, how we measure effectiveness for a government corporation will probably look different than how we measure effectiveness for a traditional government agency. Maybe perhaps there is that bottom line that will be a measure of the effectiveness of that government corporation that would then not be a measure of effectiveness for that government agency. So the type of organization will have an impact upon how we identify and how we measure and eventually how we promote effectiveness in that organization. So that's an important distinction. Let's do a few more distinctions between public and private sector organizations. Another way we can distinguish is between public and private organizations in terms of who owns them and then who funds them. Where does their money come from? Top left there, we have organizations that are publicly owned and publicly funded. And so those are your kind of pure government organizations, Department of Defense, Social Security Administration, police departments. Those are your traditional government organizations. Contrast that to the bottom right. Those are privately owned and privately funded organizations, your basic corporations like IBM and General Electric and General Motors. Those are your truly private types of organizations. Top right, you have organizations that are privately owned but publicly funded. So these will be things such as defense contractors that get a majority of their funding from these government contracts, but they are still a privately owned corporation. Bottom left, you then have publicly owned and privately funded. These are a lot of those government corporations, such as the U.S. Postal Service, government-owned utilities, and the Federal Home Loan Bank Board are examples. Again, just kind of this typology of we can distinguish between these organizations based upon who owns them and then who funds them. The funding is really important. We'll get more into the funding in a couple of minutes, but when we're trying to measure effectiveness, it's important for us to know where the revenue is coming from. How stable are those revenue sources? Typically, the more stable the revenue source is, the less of a focus on efficiency and sometimes even the less of a focus on effectiveness. If, however, those revenues are coming from profits, they're a market-based source of revenue, then there's obviously going to be a premium that's placed upon efficiency, a premium placed upon the quality of the good or the service that's being created by that corporation. So ownership and funding will have big impacts upon how we measure effectiveness in our organizations. Let's look at this typology of organizations a little bit differently, and let's look at in terms of the economic authority or political authority of the organization. So some organizations like true government agencies, they rank very high on political authority, but very low on economic authority. So on your x-axis, you have political authority. So obviously, the farther you are to the left on your political authority axis, the less political authority there is. The farther you are to the right, the more political authority. Your economic authority is then on your y-axis. The higher you go on your y-axis, the more economic authority. The lower you go on the y-axis, obviously, the less economic authority. They can see all these different organizations arrayed based upon political versus economic authority. Government agencies that are funded from public taxpayer dollars are at the bottom right, very high on political authority, very low on economic authority, and that the authority is coming from government, it's coming from legislation, as opposed to coming from the market. Top left-hand side, you have your private firms managed by an owner. These are true private organizations. Their guidance, their authority comes from the market as opposed to coming from a legislature or some type of a political type of entity. They can see all the other organizations arrayed throughout there. Next to private firms, closely held private firms that are professionally managed, still very high on economic authority, but moving up a little bit on the political authority spectrum. Corporations with shares traded publicly on the stock market, moving a little bit more toward political authority, but still at the top of the screen, so still much more in terms of economic authority. Corporations heavily relied on government contracts, GSEs, government corporations, government agencies. As you move down further and further and closer to political authority, and then you kind of have the opposite going on with your other line, your other incline there. Small voluntary associations ranking very low on both economic as well as political authority, and then so on and so on. So seeing who has the authority, who has the control over an organization, obviously will also help you in terms of trying to define and measure effectiveness. When you have an organization that ranks very high on political authority, effectiveness measures are probably going to be defined for you in your enabling legislation. So the enabling legislation is going to say, here are the goals of this organization. Here are the goals of these programs and policies that are being implemented by this organization. If you're a private firm and you rank very high on economic authority, then most of that guidance in terms of effectiveness will come from the market itself. And it'll come from whether or not people are purchasing your good and how much of your good those people are purchasing. So just another way to look at these differences between organizations. We can then take both of those previous slides and kind of combine them together into this typology that compares organizations based upon who owns the organization, whether it's public or private, where the funding comes from, whether it's public or private, and then who controls it. Is it controlled by the market? Is it controlled by essentially society, what we call a polyarchy? So if it's government, it's going to be controlled more by society, by polyarchy. If it's private, it's going to be more controlled by the market. Then you can see all your different types of organizations arrayed there on the left side of the screen. Obviously, a bureau, a government agency is going to be public owned, public funded, and controlled by polyarchy, something like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Government corporations are publicly owned, but they are privately funded. But as publicly owned organizations, their mode of social control is still society, is still a polyarchy. GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises, are privately owned, but they are publicly funded. Again, polyarchy. Regulated enterprises, privately owned, privately funded, but they are so heavily regulated that the control is going to come from these regulations that come from, say, for example, a public utilities commission. So still falls under the polyarchy mode of social control. Government enterprises, they're publicly owned, they're publicly funded, but they are again traded on the stock market. And so there's kind of this market type of orientation in terms of their control. State-owned enterprises, publicly owned, privately funded, market social control. Method of government contractors, privately owned, publicly funded, market mode of control. And then finally, private corporations, privately funded, privately owned, and market control. So again, this just kind of takes those previous two slides and combines them together in terms of ownership, control, and then who is funding either public or private these different types of organizations. So again, the so what here is the moral of the story is we really need to know what type of organization we are dealing with before we can really start to study how effective that organization is. So let's really start to drill down into some of these real differences between public and private organizations and what those differences then mean for measuring effectiveness. Now, there is an article by Graham Allison. I think it's actually listed as a reading for next week. So if you haven't read it yet, that's fine. But please do read that article for next week. And in that article by Graham Allison, which you may have read before in the program, Allison tells us about some of the similarities and differences between public and private organizations. I think I had mentioned this briefly last week. In Allison's article, he makes the argument that public and private organizations are similar in the basic management functions. So public and private organizations, they all have to staff, they all have to budget, they all have to do reporting, they all have to coordinate, they all have to strategically plan. Those are functions that are generic management functions like we talked about last week. The difference, according to Allison, is how they carry out those functions. So here we're going to talk about kind of the how rather than the what. We're going to talk about the how. How is it different in the public sector? And then what does that mean for the measurement of effectiveness? So as you know by now, since you've been in the program for a while, you know that there are different environments between public and private sector. And next week, we'll really get into some of those details of those different environments between public and private sector organizations. But we know for our purposes now that public organization governments tend to rely upon appropriations for their revenue. Private corporations tend to rely upon profits. Well, so what? The so what here is that if you're relying upon appropriations, appropriations tend to be much more stable in nature than profits. Profits can come and go. There are a lot of things that can happen that could reduce your profits. You may have other corporations that enter into the market that will erode your market share. You could have perhaps new innovations and new products that come on the market that are viewed as being better than your product that will erode your market share. You could have maybe some type of a disaster in your manufacturing plant that could affect your amount of supply that you're able to create, that could have an impact upon your market share, that could have an impact upon your profits. So profits are very transient. Appropriations tend to be much more stable. And we know when budgeting is done in most governmental levels, what we tend to see is incrementalism. We see very small changes to our government budgets from one year to the next. Typically, we'll take the appropriations that an agency had last year and we'll add on maybe 2 or 3% for cost of living adjustment. And then that's what they're going to get for the next fiscal year. When you have that stability in your appropriations and you kind of know basically how much money you're going to get from one year to the next, one can argue that there's less incentive for that organization to achieve cost reduction, operating efficiencies, and effective performance. You know how much money you're going to get, and so those things aren't really going to have an impact upon your appropriations for next year, within reason. There are some caveats to that, but for the most part, your resources are going to be relatively stable. There's also potentially going to be lower efficiency in the allocation of resources. You don't have that reflection of consumer preferences, so you don't know what consumers prefer and what consumers do not prefer. So you really don't know how to allocate your resources to meet the wants, needs, and desires of the consumers of the goods and services that you are creating, like you would be able to do over in the private sector. You essentially don't have those market indicators that you would have in the private sector. In the private sector, you have market indicators to allow you to determine what is your optimal price point. How much of a supply should you be creating based upon your demand, and then what is the optimal price point in terms of the elasticity, if you will, of consumer demand. Obviously, the more elastic consumer demand is, the more your sales will be dependent upon the price of that good. So if the price of that good goes up and it's a very price elastic good, that means consumption demand is going to go down. In the public sector, sometimes we are the only provider of this good or this service. So demand is kind of set. And so the price tends to be relatively inelastic. And so you don't have those same clear market signals that you would have over in the private sector that you can then use in making your resource allocation decisions as a public sector manager. We know, and you've covered this many times before in the program, that there are elaborate and intensive formal legal constraints because of oversight from legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We always like to say in public administration that we serve many masters in the public sector. We are oftentimes our agencies are created through enabling legislation that comes out of the legislature. The legislature then tells us here are the policies or the programs that you'll be implementing. Here's the amount of money that you have in appropriations. The executive branch will then tell us essentially, how we do our job and will hold us accountable for doing our job in the way in which we're supposed to do it. The protection of individual rights will come from primarily the court system, and the court system can come in through structural remedies and consent decrees and can tell us how to do our jobs in the public sector to better protect individual rights. So you have all these constraints and all these limitations from the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. That means that it limits the autonomy of managers in making choices within their organizations. There's also a greater tendency for the proliferation of formal administrative controls. This is why we tend to see this thing known as institutional rigidity. That as organizations get older, they tend to create more and more policies and procedures. And the goal of the organization sometimes will then become adhering to these policies and these procedures as opposed to trying to meet the wants, needs, and desires of your consumers. Larger number of external sources of formal authority and influence also means that there can be greater fragmentation, which means the legislature may be telling you to go in one direction with this policy. The executive is telling you to go into another direction with the policy. You have fragmented power through your separation of powers. So then who do you believe and who do you follow? I think I made mention last week to the idea of in the Reagan administration, when Reagan wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, he did it by trying to appoint a political appointee who would essentially take down the Department of Education from inside. So you got the executive branch saying, we want to get rid of the Department of Education. But yet you had Congress that continued to fund the Department of Education and continued to pass all these different education programs and policies that were supposed to be implemented by the Department of Education. So the legislature is saying, let's grow the Department of Education, provide it with more resources and authority. And you've got the executive branch saying, no, let's do the exact opposite, and let's take the Department of Education completely out of business. That type of fragmentation obviously makes it difficult for us as public managers to define and then measure effectiveness. Legislature is giving us one definition of effectiveness. The executive is giving us a different definition of effectiveness. We know we also have the presence of more intensive external political influences in public organizations than what we normally see over in the private sector. We have a much greater diversity and intensity of external informal political influences, things such as a lot of bargaining that goes on in the public sector. When you took your 610 course, I'm sure you read about Woodrow Wilson. I'm sure you talked about the politics administration dichotomy. And then you probably talked about why the politics administration dichotomy really fell out of favor very soon after Wilson promulgated it back in 1887. By the 1930s, we had realized that there really wasn't this strict dichotomy between politics and administration. We realized that administrators got involved in the political world. There was a lot of bargaining in terms of how these policies would be implemented. There is a lot of policy formulation being done by administrators in writing the rules and regulations that will govern the implementation of these policies. So there's a lot of political bargaining. There's a lot of lobbying that affects public administrators. We are also influenced by public opinion, even though we are career civil servants. If we don't have the support of client groups and constituent groups, then we're not going to have the resources we need to then continue getting the appropriations that we need in the future. There are also obviously pressures that come to us from elected officials, that elected officials need to get reelected. And so therefore they need us to at least try and demonstrate some efficiency and some effectiveness in the ways in which we are implementing our policies and our procedures. We have a greater need for political support among constituents and client groups because we are not getting that support from political parties. And Norton Long made this argument many years ago that political parties in America really don't support public organizations and public administrators nearly as much as political parties in Europe. And so, because we're not getting support from political parties, it means that we have to find that support ourselves. We have to, as managers and leaders, build our own repository, if you will, of political support to try and combat some of these external political influence. Transactions between organization and environment. Public organizations managers are involved in production of public goods, and as we talked about before, those public goods oftentimes create a lot of significant externalities, and so we are handling those externalities. Externalities are difficult because the benefits and the costs of those externalities are oftentimes not very easy to monetize. And we oftentimes talk about using something like a cost benefit analysis. So in making our decisions, we are going to identify the cost of a course of action, the benefits of a course of action. Then we are going to monetize those costs and those benefits. That's relatively easy to do in the private sector. It's much more difficult to do when you're dealing with programs and policies that create a lot of externalities. Sometimes it's very difficult for us to measure those externalities and know the scope of those externalities because people who are benefiting from those externalities, they are free riders. And so therefore we don't have an indication of how much of this good they are consuming. We also know that some of the things we do in the public sector tend to be coercive and monopolistic. Sometimes government is the only provider of a good or a service. When government's the only provider of a good or a service, there's obviously not going to be much competition. When there's not much competition, it's then difficult for us to assess how effectively we are doing our job because people cannot vote with their feet. They can't go to any other organization to get these goods and services. We're essentially the only game in town. So monopoly sometimes makes it difficult for us to assess effectiveness. Sometimes governments then also have what are called monopsonies, in that there is only one consumer for a good or service. So a monopoly is you have one provider of a good or service, one producer of a good or service. A monopsony is when you have one consumer of that good or that service. So sometimes governments are not only monopolies, sometimes they're also monopsonies as well. Government activities also tend to have much more symbolic significance than what we might see in the private sector. So, as Mark Moore tells us, government leaders tend to have what he calls an expository role. And by expository role, he means that they're kind of role modeling, that what you do in the public sector has such great scope and magnitude that it really serves as a signal to other sectors in the country in terms of how they should act and what they should do. There's a lot more symbolic significance to what we do in the public sector. There's also, as you know, a lot more public scrutiny for public managers. And that's especially true here in California. We have a lot of these transparency types of requirements. We have the Brown Act. We have a Public Records Act. So a lot of organizations today are spending a lot of their time and a lot of their resources responding to public record requests. So if any of you deal with a public records request, you know that you have to respond to that public records request by law within 10 days. You have to then produce all the documentation that is responsive to that public records request. But sometimes that could mean going through years and years of email communications on a server in order to produce the documents that are responsive to that public records request. That's all part of this greater scrutiny for public managers. You go and ask a private corporation for 10 years of their emails on a topic, and they're going to say, thanks for trying, and that's going to be the end of that. Government organization has to produce that information. And here in California, not to digress too much, but a few years ago, we had what was called the San Jose decision. And the San Jose decision says that when public organizations respond to public records requests, they not only have to look at emails, but they also have to then look at text messages as well. So if you have exchanged text messages with another member of the organization on this topic that is a subject of this public records request, all of that information, all those text messages, even if they're on your personal phone, those text messages are also discoverable as part of this public records request. So, and when I was on the school board, this happened a few times where every member of the board would then be asked, do you have any text messages that deal with this topic? And then you'd have to go back and look at your phone to see if there are any text messages. If there were, then you would have to produce those messages then for the district to then disclose to the requester in this public records request. If you didn't, then you would sign an affidavit saying that I attest under perjury, under threat of perjury, that I have none of this communication on this topic. So that's the greater public scrutiny that we have with public managers and public organizations. There are also these unique expectations in the public sector for fairness, responsiveness, honesty, openness, and accountability, as we have talked about before. So the transactions between the organization and the environment tend to be different with public organizations as opposed to private organizations. We will spend 1 week of our course together later on talking about goals and mission statements and value statements, and we'll talk about what goals mean then for effectiveness. We know in the public sector there tends to be greater goal ambiguity, greater goal multiplicity, and greater goal conflict than in the private sector. Our goals in the public sector tend to be much more vague, much more intangible, and much more difficult to measure. Our performance criteria also tend to be more difficult to measure than in the private sector. And again, because we have all these additional values that we need to adhere to in public administration. We also have greater multiplicity of goals because the goals are coming to us not just from the organization itself, but from a legislative body, from an executive body, from the courts. And so we have much more multiplicity of these goals. And when you have multiplicity of goals, you then, as we said before, can have much more goal conflict. So the conflict between efficiency and social equity, the conflict between efficiency and being open to public scrutiny, all those things come into conflict with each other, thus making it more difficult for us to measure effectiveness through the achievement of goals. So we know that a lot of the functions that public and private sector managers tend to be similar to each other. It's how we do them in the public sector that is different. In the public sector, we tend to have to deal with a lot more interventions, a lot more interruptions, a lot more what we call fire drills in the public sector. A lot of our strategic planning tends to be much more difficult in the public sector because we have all these interventions and all these interruptions. We basically have to make these changes on the fly. We have to respond to changes in our environment sometimes quicker than you might have to in an established private organization. So running public organizations tends to be much different than running a private organization in terms of the how of what you are doing. Public managers also tend to have less decision-making autonomy and flexibility than their private sector counterparts because of all these external and political influences. We also know that public managers tend to have less autonomy and less control over managing their personnel. We know that public employees are civil service employees as opposed to at-will employees in the private sector. So when you are managing a civil service employee, you need to abide by civil service regulations and endeavor not to violate those regulations. You also are much more likely to have a unionized employee base in the public as compared to the private sector. About 3 times more likely in the public sector to have a union as opposed to in the private sector. Over 30% of public employees nationwide are unionized. That means that you then have a collective bargaining agreement overlaid on top of your civil service regulations. So managers need to work within the parameters of both civil service as well as the parameters of the collective bargaining agreement. If any of you do procurement and purchasing in your organization, you know that we have a lot of limitations, a lot of regulations that affect purchasing and procurement. You know that if you are contracting with a private sector company, that we have a public contract code here in California that tends to be very lengthy and very detailed. And you have to follow that public contract code to a T in terms of going out there and putting out requests for proposals, how you review those requests for those bids that come in response to that request for proposal, making sure that the proposal that you are selecting is a responsive proposal and that the bidder is a fiscally responsive bidder, handling bid protests. There are a lot of hoops we have to jump through in the public sector when we are engaging in purchasing and procurement, much more so oftentimes than in the public sector, in the private sector. As such, sometimes in the public sector, higher level public managers will show a greater reluctance to delegate authority to their subordinates when they have limited authority to begin with. It's difficult to ask them to then take their remaining authority and delegate that remaining authority to their subordinates. And so sometimes it's difficult for us to achieve what Mary Parker Follett would refer to as democratic organizations. We also know that we have a lot of turnover at the top levels of our organizations. We have turnover due to elections and changing in political appointees. And we've known that every 4 years, or it seems like we are really shifting from one policy approach to another very quickly. Now, from the Obama administration, we then changed very quickly into the Trump administration. From the Trump administration, changed very quickly into the Biden administration. New sets of political appointees then come into these federal organizations. The more turnover you have at the top level of your organization, obviously, the more difficult it is for you to measure effectiveness. And there's a lot of turnover in the public sector. Organization structure. We rely upon bureaucratic structures in the public as well as the private sector, but a lot of literature will tell us that in the public sector, we tend to have more elaborate bureaucratic structures than the private sector and a lot more red tape, a lot more policies, procedures, and regulations in the public as compared to the private sector. Now, again, that's a broad brushstroke because we're comparing public versus private. There are a lot of nuances in terms of public and private organizations. I think we really need to look at the specific organization and the specific culture within that organization. We also know that in the public and private sector, as Graham Allison tells us, we both engage in strategic decision-making and strategic planning. But in the public sector, our strategic planning and our decision-making processes tend to be subject to much more in terms of interruptions and interventions and greater involvement of external authorities than what we would see over in the private sector. A public records request, for example, could really divert resources away from one policy and divert them toward that PRR request. And as such, you then have to stop what you're doing, go and respond to that public records request before you can then continue with what you were originally doing. So a lot of interruptions, a lot of interventions. Then there's this issue of pay for performance, this issue of incentives. Obviously, it's much easier to have pay for performance and to have monetary incentives in the private sector as compared to the public sector. We will spend an entire week in this class talking about how you incentivize performance and how you motivate employees. We know that public employees tend to be motivated more by internal types of incentives as opposed to the external incentives that are oftentimes used in the private sector. We are also very limited in the public sector, not just in terms of using pay for performance. We're also very limited in terms of promotions and using promotions to motivate employees. We know that it's difficult to promote someone unless the actual nature of their job has changed. So if we conduct a reclassification study and we find out that, yes, the nature of this job has changed substantially enough so that we can reclassify it to a higher level, both then that person will get more pay and that person will move to a higher pay grade. But it would have to be because the nature of that job has actually fundamentally changed. We can't just pay people more, give them bonus pay, and then give them a higher level positions based upon performance like you could do over in the private sector. Oops. If you're really interested in pay for performance, you're really interested in this idea of what motivates public employees. James Perry and Ed Kellogg are two authors. I think I mentioned them last week. They can go and take a look at. They talk a lot about what motivates public employees, but for the most part, public employees have more of this public service motivation and a lower valuation on monetary incentives than their private sector counterparts. We'll also talk in this class about how performance is a function of satisfaction. Obviously, the more satisfied your employees, the more likely they are to provide contributions to the organization, to be more productive, and to try and make the organization more effective. Studies for years have shown that employees in both the public as well as the private sectors, they seem to be relatively satisfied with their jobs. Satisfaction levels in the private sector tend to trend higher than satisfaction levels in the public sector. Both sectors have high satisfaction levels, but private sector satisfaction levels tend to be a little bit higher than what we tend to see in the public sector. We'll talk about that in a future class, and I'll show you an example of the study the federal government does every year, looking at employee engagement and employee satisfaction. And we'll take a look at which agencies at the federal level tend to have higher satisfaction levels as compared to other organizations. But obviously, the more satisfied your employees, the more productive your employees will be, and hopefully the more that will contribute to the effectiveness of the organization. Then another difference between public and private sectors is in terms of how cautious and how versus how innovative public managers tend to be. The argument goes that public leaders and public managers tend to be more cautious and not quite as innovative as their private sector counterparts. And now, admittedly, some of the evidence for this is mixed in the literature, but the argument goes because of the additional limitations, because of the limitations on the autonomy of public managers are concerned about running afoul of rules and regulations, and so therefore they tend to be much more cautious. And oftentimes in public organizations, we reward people for following policies and procedures in terms of employee of the week and whatever types of non-monetary rewards we can give, as opposed to rewarding people based upon being innovative and being creative. And so sometimes public employees feel that there's a disincentive for them to, I hate the term think outside the box, but for them to be innovative and creative in doing their jobs on a daily basis. Again, the literature is a little bit mixed on this, but I think the overall perception is that public employees tend to be a little bit more cautious than their private sector counterparts. The more cautious and the less innovative we are will have an impact upon how effective we are being as an organization. And we know effective organizations tend to be those organizations that allow their employees to have the freedom to try out new things, to be creative without the fear of being penalized if those new and those innovative processes don't work out on the first try. So again, this is just kind of a real quick overview of some of the differences between public and private organizations and what it may then mean for measuring effectiveness in those organizations. Again, I think one of the big takeaways from this discussion up to this point in time is that I think we are best served when we do not look at public and private organizations as a dichotomy. We need to recognize that there are a lot of gradations in between. And we are looking at the effectiveness of your organization. You need to think about what type of organization you are dealing with. Or if you're not using your organization, whatever organization you select to use, what type of organization is it? How close is it to the far right end of the spectrum with a government organization? How far is it to the other side of the spectrum in a private corporation? That can certainly have an impact upon how we measure effectiveness. Think about where the funding comes from for the organization. Think about the ownership of the organization. Think about the control. Is it more of a polyarchy control, more of a market-based type of control? Where does the authority come from? Is it economic authority? Is it political authority? And by using all these different nuances, I think that we can have a more specific definition of what we mean by effectiveness in an organization and then how we can measure that effectiveness. So again, this just kind of gets us going in terms of differences between public and private sector organizations, and then what those differences may mean for the measurement of effectiveness. So I've been talking for a while now. So are there any questions or clarifications or observations on any of this type of preliminary information? Leslie, go ahead.
Okay, so I just had a quick question since you kind of talking about this whole lecture that we've just gone through. My question is related to funding. And back on slide 6 or 7, you had that chart of 4 squares with public ownership, private ownership, public funding, private funding. So I'm trying to make a distinction. Yes, that chart about public funding versus private funding. So if a government, let's say just like department, um, is funded entirely through fees, is that a sale or is that a tax? Is that public or is that private?
I'm going to say it depends because it depends on if it's a fee or if it's a charge. Oftentimes governments will talk about charges and fees interchangeably, but there is a difference between a charge and a fee. A charge is something that is going to be tied to the consumption of some type of a service. And so if it's a consumption of utilities or trash collection, that's what would be considered to be a charge. A fee is something that is more closely aligned with the privilege of engaging in a type of behavior. So a fee could be, you want to hunt, and so you have to get a hunting license and pay a fee. You want to fish, you have to get a fishing license, you have to pay a fee. So I think there's a difference between user charges and user fees. The question about the funding and whether it's public or private really gets to the point of who is charging that charge or that fee, who is imposing it, who is collecting it. And if it's government that's collecting a charge or a fee, then I think that would still be considered to be public funding because it's still under the auspices of the government, perhaps not as traditionally public as taxpayer dollars. I think that would still be considered to be public in nature if it's under the auspices of that government organization. So usually we look at user charges, user fees from a government, we're usually talking about that as being public funding.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Good question. Okay, let's see. Check chat. We have a couple of things here. My cursor is not moving for me. So can a fee include global entry? I would think it would, is because it's being imposed by, if it's being imposed by government, it's being collected by government, and it is for the privilege of engaging in a certain type of activity. I would say yes, that would be considered a fee as opposed to a charge. Charges usually include fines. Charges usually include fines. Typically, what governments will do is they'll report fines and forfeitures separately from charges and fees. So usually that will be a separate category in the budget. So you have user charges, user fees, and then you'll have fines and forfeitures. So usually fines are going to be a different category in a local government budget. Good question. Okay, sure. Happy to answer. It's about 7:20, so I'm kind of inclined to take a little bit of a break here if everyone else would agree with that. So let's go ahead and take about a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 7:35. When we come back at 7:35, if you have any more questions about any of this information, we can cover those questions. If not, then we'll go ahead and move into those breakout groups that we were going to do last week. And I'll break you up into some groups. And then, as we had talked about last week, for those breakout groups, we'll be looking at the issue of effectiveness, and we'll try and come up with some definitions of what we consider to be effectiveness in the public and nonprofit sectors. and then how we know if an organization is effective. But take 15 minutes, come on back, and then once we come back, I'll go ahead and create our breakout groups, and we'll do our breakout groups for the remainder of the session. Okay, enjoy your break, and I'll see you back here in 15 minutes. Okay, we are back, hopefully. So what we'll do now is we will do those breakout groups that I promised you last time that we didn't have the opportunity to do. So we're going to do them tonight. What I'm going to do is put you into breakout groups, and then each group will come up with a definition of what you consider to be effectiveness in a public or nonprofit organization. And then what types of indicators would you use to know if an organization is effective? And it will ask that if each of our breakout groups could select a spokesperson, and then that spokesperson, after we reconvene as a class, can then share out the results from the group. That would be great. So go ahead and start setting up our breakout rooms. Let's see. Let's go with 5 breakout rooms. I think that probably is manageable. Any more than 5, it gets a little unwieldy. So we're going to just automatically create 5 breakout groups. Let me go ahead and do that. And so it looks like everyone's been assigned to a room. I'll go ahead and open up the rooms. Let's work on this until, let's give you about half an hour to work on this in your groups. Then we'll reconvene as a class, and then we'll see what each group came up with. And I'll also then give you a little heads up as when we have 5 minutes left in the groups, when we have 2 minutes left in the group, and just to make sure that everyone has ample time to wrap everything up. Okay? So I'm going to open up the rooms, and then you can have at it. So the rooms are open, so feel free to go to your room, and then we will see what we all come up with in about half an hour or so. Okay, hopefully we are all back in the main classroom now. So I hope that was enough time to do your work. And so again, the purpose was to come up with the definition of effectiveness, and then how you know what types of indicators you'd look at to determine the effectiveness of an organization. So let's see what everyone came up with. So let's start out with room number 1. So that was Cynthia, Jacqueline, Joanna, Jocelyn, Karen, Sharon, and Vanessa.
Great evening, everyone. This is Sharon. I'm going to start it off. We all had great points and views. So we're all going to just give you a little snippet of what we talked about. When it comes to the effectiveness in the public sector, we talked about how it refers to the results on whether an organization has reached their goal. We talked about how the effectiveness would determine the success of the goals or the productiveness of it, or if it even exceeds the goals. That's how we were talking about the effectiveness in the public sector.
We also discussed indicators. So for example, a couple indicators that we listed was organizational performance, right? So sort of what she just discussed. Are we meeting benchmarks? Do we have annual performance reports that we review? For example, are we analyzing our framework? Does the organization have a strategic management plan set in place? So like a structure, a plan of action to meet their objectives. Another indicator is employee experience. So is there a lot of staff turnover? Are we retaining our staff? Do we have high morale, low morale within the organization? Another indicator would be quality of leadership. So for example, do we have a transformational leader in position, or do we have a leader who's a micromanager and maybe just wants to feed their ego or continue to advance for their own personal gain? So, what's the quality of leadership? Another indicator would be constituent needs. So are we meeting our constituent needs? And lastly, resources. Are we maximizing our resources, for example, technology?
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much for that. And I would agree. I think that, when we think about effectiveness, typically we think about achieving our goals, and that's usually the way in which we define effectiveness. And I think you mentioned a lot of good ways to measure effectiveness, and we'll talk about a lot of these in our ensuing weeks. Things like benchmarking, you had mentioned, things like having transformational leaders, and we'll talk about the impact of leadership on effectiveness. We'll spend an entire week talking about that. Constituent needs, that's an important one from a participant satisfaction type of perspective. Are we meeting the wants, needs, and desires of our constituents? The idea about resources and looking at the resources that the organization is acquiring. That's another model of effectiveness we'll talk about in a few weeks, the systems resource approach. And so I think that's a good multifaceted way of not only defining effectiveness, but also different discrete ways in which we'll talk about how you can measure effectiveness as we move throughout the term. So great. I think that's an excellent start. So thank you very much. Group number 2. I think that's Ariel, Brittany, Janet, Janelle, Kurt, Kylene, and Narissa.
Hello, good evening. This is Janelle, representing group room 2. I'm just going to read some of the notes that we came up with. Effectiveness in public and nonprofit sector is how an organization achieves its goals and objectives in serving the public or accomplishing its mission. In public organizations, effectiveness is often measured by the extent to which they meet their mandated objectives and serve the public's interests. In public organizations, effectiveness is measured by the financial metrics such as profitability, return on investment, and market shares. So that's kind of the difference. How we uphold values or social equity, protecting individuals' rights, responsiveness to public forces, and pressures, and how our bureaucracy represents the population that it serves. And by using outcome-based metrics, such as number of individuals it serves.
Yeah, and again, we see the focus on goals, which again, that's by far the most common way in which we measure effectiveness. And I think that, as we've talked about, the values and the differing values in public organizations are important.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Computer up. What were you saying?
I'm sorry, I was just agreeing with you. I was saying, goals are important in terms of the way in which we measure effectiveness across the board.
I don't know if it.
Are you still there?
I think we
okay, thank you. Yeah, I think was it just me, or can anybody hear me?
I think it was just you.
Hey, I think it's messing up. I'm so sorry because everybody's breaking up when they're talking to me, so I can't really hear anything. I'm sorry.
No worries. I was basically just agreeing with you. I think the group came
Okay,
up with
thank
a
you.
good measure.
I'm sorry. It looked like it signed out and it signed me in. But basically, you can measure the effect with the stakeholder satisfaction, the impact that it has on the organization, the efficiency. Those are a few examples.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, that gets us into some other models of effectiveness that we're going to talk about later on as well. We're looking at, how well we're meeting the needs of citizens and consumers or clients, if you want to call them that. And so, yeah, I think that type of satisfaction is another participant satisfaction model of effectiveness we'll talk about in a few weeks. So I think that's excellent. Well done. Group number 2. So I guess we'll move on to group number 3. That's Christine, David, Fabiola, Leslie.
Yes. We will add to the chorus of groups endorsing the goals. So our definition is maybe a little bit more broad than everybody else's. We said organizations that are effective are organizations that meet their stated goals. And important in that fact is that the goals need to be aligned with the organization's mission and vision. And perhaps part of that is, reevaluating whether the goals are still aligned or if our mission is still on track periodically. So keeping those up to date. We can determine an organization's effectiveness by creating measurable goals. So we got to make sure that not only do we have goals, but that we have a means to measure them. And then you actually need to measure them. So there's plenty of organizations out there who state a goal and never determine whether or not they meet that goal. So we think measuring is an important aspect of that.
Yep, I agree absolutely. And usually when we design goals, we want those goals to be SMART goals, and so we certainly want them to be measurable. We want them to be achievable. Have reporting mechanisms for them. And I think you're right. Any of us who are participating in strategic planning, we know that sometimes if you're always planning, you're never actually doing. And so a lot of organizations spend a lot of time creating goals, but then they never go about putting together the action plans to achieve those goals. And so I think that putting them into practice is an important part for every organization. And we'll spend an entire week talking about the creation of goals. We'll talk about operative goals and official goals, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which we can make sure that those goals are aligned with our strategic plan and aligned with our mission statement for our organization as well. Because that's another important point, that your goals need to be well aligned with the mission of the organization, what the organization is all about. So good. And it's not surprising to see, every group start out with goals, because I think that goal attainment model is by far the most common way in which we measure effectiveness, both in the public as well as the private sectors. So very good. Thank you. We'll go with room number 4 now. It's Anthony, Christian, Daniela, Joshua,
and Maria. And I'll go ahead and go ahead and represent my group. So we came up with a definition. Effectiveness is the ability to achieve the goals and missions and measuring the programs and outcomes and services, ensuring they are meeting the needs and making a positive difference. And key indicators, we said that these are your external outputs, such as number of consumers or clients served, quality and accessibility of the services they are provided to citizens, response times, accuracy of information that is provided, user satisfaction with public services, and public trust. And then the way we would measure private public sector, we said that it's based on productivity, cost of per unit, inventory turnover, improving efficiency also helps, with the cost and increased productivity. Private companies may also track their market share relative to competition to assess their position in the industry. So a key component of efficiency and effectiveness is innovation with private industries. So staying competitive and when introducing a new product, how that product is really helpful out there in the market would be another way that can be measured. And then some of the tools that can be used are surveys, focus groups, having a feedback loop, stakeholder feedback loop and customer service, right? That would help the organizations to continue to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the organization. And if my group wants to add anything else that I missed, please do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, I think that's very complete. I think that it's a really great definition that your group came up with, because I think what you've done with that definition is you've kind of encompassed all the different models of effectiveness all at once. And so I think that's very well done. I think the focus on outputs and outcomes is also an important focus that we'll talk more about this term. The output will be, the goods and services that are being created, measuring the quality of those goods and services, the amount of those goods and services. And then there's the outcome, which will be the consequences of those goods and services, which really then gets us to that idea of satisfaction, constituent satisfaction. And so it's very well done. I think that's a great holistic type definition. Good job. Thank you, Maria. And we'll move on to group number 5.
Hi, this is Janine Bryant. I'm going to speak for the group. We had a really lively discussion and a lot of different conversations and ideas, so I'm doing my best to boil it down. And so we defined effectiveness as the ability of an organization to achieve their goals and objectives, which includes meeting the intent of the grants that they are utilizing on behalf of the population that they're serving or delivering to. How how do you know if an organization is effective? We looked at measuring an organization's productivity and measuring stakeholder satisfaction to include customer or client satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and external stakeholders satisfaction, which could include government officials. We defined effectiveness as determining if the goods or services are having a positive effect on either a socioeconomic problem or addressing the needs of a community, and being profitable, though we put that in quotes, and also being financially sustainable in a way that they can continue serving the audiences that they are serving.
Thank you, Janine. Well done. And I think the distinction there when we're looking at the stakeholder satisfaction that you made is really good one in terms of internal versus external. With external satisfaction, we're looking at the external environment, constituents and citizens, but we also have to make sure that we understand that our employees are also stakeholders as well. And so once we look internal at our employees, then we're kind of looking inward within the walls of the organization in kind of an internal process way of trying to measure effectiveness. And so then discrete measures of effectiveness then become all those measurements of organizational health, employee satisfaction, measuring hopefully lower levels of turnover. And those are all kind of those organizational health types of indicators. I had written something else down here. Oh, I just forgot what it was. But again, I really think that differentiation between the external versus internal stakeholders is an important one. That's something that we are going to follow up on in future weeks of the course as well. So good. I think that we have seen some real similarities between our groups in terms of all the groups, focus on goals and the achievement of goals. I think that's natural because goal attainment is a primary way in which we define effectiveness. But as we go through the course, we'll also talk about systems resource model, looking at the resources that the organization's able to generate. We'll look at participant satisfaction model, both external as well as internal stakeholders. We'll look at internal process model and define effectiveness by the processes that are going on within the organization and how all those processes contribute to organizational health. And so I think the unifying theme here is that the primary way we look at effectiveness always tends to be attainment of goals, but there are other ways in which you can measure effectiveness as well. So if we are in a situation where we have multiple goals, we have conflicting goals, we don't have very clear goals, we're not able to use a goal attainment approach, there are other ways in which we can measure effectiveness in our organizations. And we'll cover all those different ways we can measure effectiveness as we go out throughout the remainder of our term together. Great. Well, thank you very much for that. It's worked the way in which I hoped. And so I hope that at least, doing these breakout groups, it's nice that you don't have to listen to me for a while, and it kind of breaks up, pun intended, what we do each week. And so I'm going to try and incorporate as many of these breakout groups opportunities as I can moving forward in the course. That's what I have for tonight. So please do remember, you have your first graded Canvas essay, your initial post due by Saturday, and then your responses to 2 classmates due by Monday. Hopefully I'll have a chance to go through all of those before we meet in class again next Tuesday. Then next Tuesday, we're going to turn our attention a little bit to kind of look at the environment of public organizations and talk about what the environment then means for the measurement and achievement of effectiveness. Leslie, go ahead.
I'm wondering if you'd be willing to shift where the discussion forms lay in the modules tab on Canvas. Because I'm really scared of doing the wrong one. The discussion forum number 1 is listed under week 1.
Yeah.
And I know one of these days I'm gonna do the wrong one.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can do that. I can shift
I think
them
they all just
down
need to be
so
like
they align.
shifted down one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I
Thank
can
you.
do that tonight. No worries. Thanks for that. Any other questions or any other observations before we call it an evening? As always, any questions that you have, feel free to send me emails and I will be available to answer all of your questions. I look forward to reading your Canvas essays. And then, like I said, next Tuesday, we'll be back at it with a discussion of the impact of the environment of organizations on effectiveness. Okay? All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Have a great week. And I will talk to you next Tuesday night. Take care.
Have a great
Thank you.
night.
Thank
Have a
thank you,
good night.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.